then I practiced law for 15 years. I was an employment lawyer, dealing quite a bit with the issues of racism, sexism, especially in the workplace. And then went back in-house counsel at the University of Notre Dame, represented the university for about 10 years in all different sorts of legal matters. And then from there, at the ripe age of about 40, transitioned over to Notre Dame athletics and started working with Jack Swarbrick and staff, and did that for about 9 years, and decided I got my MBA during that process too, which was a good life-changing experience for me. I learned a lot about myself, and then a few years ago decided I wanted to try and be an athletic director, and put myself out there and failed, and then got the job offer at St. Joseph's University in Philadelphia, and I just finished my second year at St. Joe's. So thanks again. I'll let Jen go and look forward to the conversation.
Well, good evening, all. It's great to see so many faces, and I too, like Jill, am thankful to Daniel for putting this together, and I know I always gain more from all of you than from anything else in this, and also I'm willing to make myself vulnerable. I grew up outside Philadelphia and was a softball student athlete at Penn, and then made my way to the NCAA. I started as an intern, and was thankful to be there about 9 years, not all of them as an intern, but then made my way to Columbia University and spent 3 years there. I took a stint back at the NCAA where I dealt mostly with policy and some bigger picture pieces, particularly in the academic world, and then was fortunate 8 years ago to make my way to the University of Miami. Didn't think I'd stay that long, but have come to really fall in love with South Florida, and really feel like at a place where I can make a difference within this athletic department and continue to move the needle forward. So I've really found a place that is the right fit for me, both personally and professionally.
Thank you, Jen. We do have questions that we will be going over to start the discussion. However, if you do have a question during the discussion that you would like to ask, feel free to put it in the chat at the bottom, and we will try our best to get to some of those questions during the process. So the first thing that we would like to do is to have a small, about a 45 to a minute second reflection. So I ask that everyone close your eyes and think about the athletic department, or if you are not affiliated with an athletic department, think about the department that you work in. Think about your coworkers, what they look like, what their names are. Think about their position and title. And as you think about these things, I want you to kind of think about everything that's going on in our country as it relates to racism, social injustices. And I want you to think about, if you do see one of your colleagues of color's face come across during your thinking, you don't have to answer out loud, but just think about, did I reach out to them during this time? And if I did reach out to them, what did I say? If I did not reach out to them, why did I not reach out to them? Was it because I was uncomfortable? Was it because I wasn't sure what to say? So just begin to think about these things. So as we come back in together and begin the conversation, I really want us to reflect on kind of those questions, and then begin to analyze ourselves, begin to check any biases or thoughts that we may have. Did we see our colleagues of color as a threat? What was the reasoning behind reaching out or not reaching out? Was it genuine? Or was it just you wanting to make sure that you were still in good with that colleague? So as we begin the questions, I will, reiterate for those who have just come in and joined us, welcome. I'm glad to have you. I hope that you benefit from this in the same manner in which I believe I will. But for the chat session at the bottom, if you have any questions as we go along through this process, please feel free to write them in. And as they come in, I will try to work them in to our conversation. So with that being said, let's get this show on the road. Jill, first question. What does support look like for your Black colleagues in your department normally and now in a crisis, especially as we talk about some of the social injustice and racism that's going on?
So I'll start with, I think you said sort of normal state versus during these recent past few weeks. And I think during normal state, where I try hard to have some action, is to be a mentor. And so at any given time, I have 4 to 6 people who I kind of work with formally or informally, who are Black men and women who I want to help succeed. Daniel, that's kind of how you and I met. You know, you impressed me right away, and we became obviously good friends, and I hope you see me as a mentor. So, you know, normal state, I guess, I find that our hiring practices need a lot of work. And so what I can do best is try and help ready people for the jobs. So that's, you know, I would say normal state. I also give myself a, you know, a C- to make myself vulnerable. Like I don't do enough. And so that's really struck me how deficient my responses have been and how much I take for granted. And I don't say this in any way to give you my bona fides, but I say, like I grew up knowing better, right? And my college graduation gift was a signed copy of Morris Dees, the founder of Southern Poverty Law Center's book, A Season for Justice. My dad's a civil rights lawyer. You know, I'm a legal guardian to a young Black woman who I raised for 12 years. Like I know better, and I still give myself a C. And my excuses are, you know, you get caught up in the day to day, and you just, if it's not top of mind, and it needs to be. So what I've learned about myself in these times is I got complacent, and so, you know, what it's looked like sort of, you know, during these past few weeks is my own period of emotions and a lot of conversation, including with you and with Jen, which I'll get to in a little bit. And a lot of reflecting, a lot of crying, getting myself in a position where I knew I had to wanted to make a statement, but trying to process my own emotions. And then I would say, you know, in terms of what does support look like, connection. There's at least one person who's been one of my rocks during this, Christina Fogarty, who's my right hand, my chief of staff, and you know, listening to her, connecting with others, and what I'm hearing loud and clear is please don't let this be a 2-week issue this time. So trying to assure people that this is going to be integrated. Like I've said to several people, my God, if we put the resources we put toward COVID, toward racial injustice, we could get some shit done. And it's time to do that. And so those are just some kind of initial thoughts, Daniel, on your great intro question.
And actually, I need to go back a little bit and address the elephant in the room. I did receive some questions and some emails, you know, what is this webinar going to look like, you know, and why is it that if this is a conversation about how to care for people of color in athletic staff departments, why don't you have any people of color, you know, any Black people on the panel? And to address that is the reason behind it is because our athletic departments, this panel kind of reflects athletic departments, and the 2 speakers in Jill and Jen reflect that. If you look at NCAA demographics on their website, you will see that for every department, so we're talking about, you know, head trainers, assistant and associate ADs, athletic departments, chancellors, presidents, all of our campuses in the division NCAA, under the NCAA realm. So that's Division I, Division II, and Division III. Over 70% of the people in those positions are white. And that's for every position except for academic counselor and life skills development. And so when you ask, it's because the leadership that is at the top of our institutions and our athletic departments this panel kind of reflects that. So I just kind of wanted to address that for anybody who may be wondering or have those thoughts. It starts with leadership, I believe, and the only way that we can make the proper and necessary changes is for leadership to understand that. So I hope that you all begin to think about that and to analyze that as we continue to move along in this conversation. So moving to you, Jen, I guess I would ask, based off of what Jill said and what I just spoke about and how our leadership looks, what are some things that white administrators and staff can be doing during this time to care for their Black colleagues during this crisis?
Yeah, I'd start with, and like Jill, I feel like I haven't done enough. And so one of the first things I'd say is it's self-reflection, and it's honest self-reflection, and looking inside ourselves to understand our own biases and our own places where we haven't stood up and taken the action that we need to. Whether that's hearing a comment and not saying something, or whether that's bigger than that in that process. But how do we really challenge ourselves to be part of the solution moving forward? And that's in a big picture sense, but that's also in little things we do on a daily basis. That's understanding our hiring practices and understanding our policies and procedures, and what pieces of those have, obviously in society, there's a lot of systematic racism that's built into practices that have been established. How do we begin to tear that down? I think you begin to tear that down by being honest in your assessment of them. And then the second thing, and maybe more important, is we need to listen. I don't think as a society we do a very good job of listening, but I certainly don't think we've done a very good job of listening, to the challenges, to the struggles, to, what Black staff members and quite frankly, Black student athletes face on a daily basis. I can't understand what it's like to walk in your shoes, but I certainly can do a better job of listening and using that then to help make decisions as we move forward, and finding the ability to create safe spaces for honest and transparent dialogue, and challenge all of us to get better in that, and challenge, me individually to continue to get better.
Absolutely. Jen, I would add on to that, after listening is educating yourself, looking up definitions, and there are plenty of resources available online. I mean, we all have iPhones, we all have smartphones, whether it be an Android or an iPhone. And I believe that second part is educating, looking up definitions. What is racism? What is whiteness? What does white privilege look like? And really beginning to realize some of the benefits that some of us have. Even though I am a Black male, and I would say that we are, at this point, targeted to an extent, and not just myself, but our Black and brown women as well. I do not want to leave them out in this conversation. But I would say the education piece is important, and not to look to your Black colleagues or your brown colleagues to educate you, but educating yourself. It's exhausting to have to continue to have conversations with white colleagues and tell them, okay, these are the resources you need to look at. These are the books you need to read. These are the things you have to think about. But beginning to, say, okay, if this is something I really want to be involved in creating change, if I want to be an advocate or be looked at as an advocate for my Black colleagues, I have to begin to know and try to understand as best as possible what they are going through on a consistent basis. And so I think that it's essential for us, after listening, is to educate and then begin to make a plan of action. I think so often we sit here and we talk about all the things that need to change, but there's no action. There's a lot of talk, it sounds good. It makes our Black colleagues feel good during the, time that we're having this conversation. And as Jill stated earlier, and then in 2 weeks, all this dies. And then what is the follow-up action? Let's put it on paper. Let's hold ourselves accountable. What are the checks and balances to make sure that we're doing that?
I agree.
So, with everything going on, I think, we all are trends and people of the moment. And so I believe, a trend, and I'm not to say that some of these weren't genuine, but a trend was athletic departments coming out with statements. You know, we support Black Lives Matter, we support our Black student athletes, and this conversation is essential because, you know, as people who work in college athletics, our main focus is on the student athletes, right? But we can't forget our staff members, and especially during this time, we can't forget our Black and brown staff members who are dealing with some mental and emotional things that they may not have dealt with to this magnitude. And so with the trend of statements being made and being put out, Jill, I would like to ask you, what was the thought process behind your statement? What triggered you to make the statement? What contributed to, you know, what the thoughts that you put into that statement? And then how will you hold yourself and your department accountable for the statement that you did put out?
Yeah, so as I mentioned in the intro, I spent a lot of time uh, processing and trying to get a hold of my own emotions, and I didn't say anything statement wise, and I have to admit I was a little bit afraid because I didn't want to say something that wasn't authentic, um, and wasn't actionable. So those were the two things. It had to include action, and it had to be authentically me. You know, you follow everyone else on social media, and people were rightly getting called out for not saying anything, and I just wanted to say something that I felt from the heart and that we knew we could follow up on. So um, you know, I sat outside on my screened-in porch on that Saturday, and I cried for about 2 hours, and I wrote something, and it wasn't very good, and I sent it to you. And then we talked about it, and you and Jen Fry and I talked about it, and I valued your feedback. I mean, some of the things I valued your feedback greatly. And again, I think I said to you, I don't want to make this your work, but I do, you know, I want you to take a look at it as a friend, and maybe I'm your mentor, but that doesn't mean I can't learn from you, and have learned a ton from you. So, you know, a couple of the things that I said, and you know, like I started it with like my feelings, and I think, you know, you and Jen both said like kind of like no one gives a shit what your feelings are right now, in a nicer way than that. Like, this isn't about me, right? It's about what I'm going to do as a white person in this time when there's blatant racism, you know, people killing people based on the color of their skin. Like, what am I going to do about that? Not what my feelings are. Talked about a typical female response, which is I don't have the answers. No one has the answers. I didn't need to say that, right? I had a line in there about a particular impact this has on Black males. And, you know, Jen had pointed out that I don't want to devalue the experience of Black females. And so it was just that iterative process. And those were the kind of suggestions and comments that you all gave to me, and for which I'm incredibly grateful. But, you know, the vast majority of it was from my heart, and really, I thought the first paragraph just called it out, right? People are getting killed based on the color of their skin. Like, I'm not dancing around the topic. This is what's happening, and it's been happening for years. And it's, you know, we pretend to be you know, this great country of equal justice for all and constitutional, and it's just not that. It's not accurate, and we need to, until we talk about that and face that, we're not going to get any better. So I wanted it to be real and authentic. And then in terms of action, you know, I mean, I had 5 steps, and it was number 1, educate yourself. As you said, not your job, not anyone else's job. Like, here's some resources, get out there and educate yourself. Number 2, like, we have to engage in dialogue. And we've had some really good dialogue. I see a couple of my coaches on the call. You know, we had an initial call where just with coaches, and people cried, and people were very vulnerable, and it was a good start, but we have to do much, much more. Number 3 was intervene. Like, if you're, you know, if you don't take action, I don't care if it's a homophobic comment, if it's a sexist, objectifying women, racist, if you don't intervene, you're complicit. And then number 4 is be accountable. And so, you know, every performance review, I'm going to ask every single person, the direct report is going to be asked, what did you do to educate yourself and to further dialogue and to take the other action in this email, right? It's not enough for me to send a list of resources to our coaches. I'm going to say to them in their annual review, what'd you take advantage of? What'd you do? What'd you discuss with your team? What books did you read as a group? We're going to hold people accountable. I'm going to hold myself more accountable for hiring. I've tried to certainly in my 2 years change the diversity, increase the diversity on our staff, but I have to do more. So I sent an email to my president saying, hold me accountable. Here's the plan. Here's what I'm saying I'm going to do. When I get my review, I expect to be held accountable. And then the fifth aspect of the plan was, everyone's got my permission to go vote. I don't care if you miss practice, if you miss a meeting, a departmental, if you leave work and it takes 11 hours to go vote, and which is a travesty in this country, but you go do it and get it done. So, and basically ended by saying, like, there's no other option. If we don't integrate this into who we are, we have failed. So that was sort of the crux of it in the iterative processing and getting there. And by no means was it perfect. But again, I decided I can't be sort of paralyzed by perfection, which I often am, and had to get something out that was authentic.
You are definitely paralyzed by perfection. I have to second that motion. But, as you stated, you put a plan of action into place, and I look forward to seeing how those actions transpire into real world. And what your department specifically does and how they grow. And with that being said, Jen, I think, to tag along with that, those are action steps. So I come to you asking, what kind of conversations have you had with some of your Black and brown employees and colleagues during this time?
Yeah, I've tried to do a lot of listening, and honestly, I probably haven't done enough. In my self-reflection, I certainly thought of a couple, several staff members who I haven't reached out to, and what my reasoning on that is. But there's certainly been a group of them that I have, and I've tried to listen and better understand the struggles and where I can be helpful, and how we can then use that to create a plan to help move us forward. I think so many times, Daniel, you hit on this at the beginning, but the focus is about student athletes, and it should be. I mean, obviously what we do on a daily basis is to support our student athletes, and I'm not minimizing that by saying that. And at Miami, that certainly was our focus that started, and in response to what our student athletes needed. And I don't know that we spent enough time trying to figure out how we help our staff of color, and that now needs to be a priority, and we need to work on a plan. And we've begun that dialogue and that conversation about how we best support our Black staff during this time as well, and still support our Black student athletes, because obviously that's a critical piece of all that we do. But finding that balance to do both, and ensure that we do both in order to better all that we're trying to accomplish.
And so in those conversations that you've had, Jen, what are maybe some of, one or two things that you've heard the voices of those staff members that they need during this time? Obviously you're not a Black or brown person that we can see, but that doesn't mean that you weren't able to connect with them and find out what are some actionable things or things that they need during this time. So do you mind sharing with us what are some, particulars or specifics that they share with you?
Yeah, I think support, clearly, love, personal space to some extent, an ability for me to be vulnerable, an understanding that there was a commitment to work towards change, and that words can't be shallow, and this can't be a 2-week process, and we need to do more beyond that. But also a lot of just, I'm struggling, and I'm speaking for what they were saying, and I don't, they don't have the words necessarily, and I didn't necessarily have the words, but there were tears, and there were moments of just trying to be supportive, but also begin to try and understand what I personally could do better and more of, and what we as a department could do better and more of. And then, how do you begin to take small steps forward towards that?
I don't want it to get lost, because I think oftentimes we may forget. However, I think that when we talk about supporting our staff members and colleagues of color, and this is, me thinking and analyzing within myself, is has anyone reached out to, and you don't have to raise your hand, but just a thought, the staff members that clean your building? I think we're so focused on our department and, the compliance director and the academic advisor, and you have janitors or whatever politically correct term that you want to use, who may be members of the Black community, who are suffering just as much and may not be getting someone to reach out to them as, someone who actually has an office and a desk and a laptop and can work from home. Have you reached out to them, to check on them and to really see how well they're doing? That's something I had to think about. That's something I haven't done. And I wonder, just how many of us have taken the time to really think about some of the different colleagues that we have who are Black and brown people that we have overlooked, maybe because of their position, in terms of reaching out and really connecting with them. If you have, I applaud you, because you're thinking outside the box. But I'm sure, I'm not alone in thinking that some of these people, have missed an opportunity to really be connected with.
Daniel, that's a great point, and made and more important than ever when we're not together personally, right? So there are folks that you see in all around campus on a regular basis, but then when either people are furloughed or off work or we're all telecommuting, it means we have to go the extra mile to connect. I certainly will and can do a better job at that. I did go to campus to spend time with and spent time with 4 or 5 of our public safety officers who are Black men and women. I think they're in a particularly interesting position now in terms of just processing their own emotions and trying to keep safety in the nearby neighborhoods. And it was great conversation. And it was, again, having those conversations helped educate me. So I think that's a great, one of the things, and just hearing Jen say, what do people need? I'll jump onto that. And part of it's just vent, know they're loved, know that we stand by them, that I'm their ally. And part of it is that please don't let this be a fad, as I mentioned earlier. And then there's this sense, like I describe, I've had to become like a micromanager during COVID-19 because there's so much happening so fast. And when you're the athletic director, I'm not normally in the weeds, but I've kind of had to be. So now people are like, hey, could I do a forum? Hey, I want people to feel empowered to do what moves them. And that it certainly can and should come from the middle-aged white AD, but it doesn't always have to come from me. And so part of it is giving people space and permission to do and organize what they feel they need to and should be doing. And so that's something I've tried to do with with all my staff is, hey, if you have an idea, you don't need to run it by me. I'm not censoring thoughts and ideas and feelings right now.
I want to just piggyback off of something you said, and it struck me when you said it doesn't have to come from me. I think a big thing that Black and brown people, your colleagues of color, struggle with is having to be the only person to speak up. Having to be that person who addresses the department and says, hey, this is going on in our country. Our student athletes are not okay. Our Black and brown staff members are not okay. And so as you mentioned, Jill, I see you as an ally and an advocate for our community, is someone else speaking up. We're on a panel currently, how do you speak up when you realize that you're on a panel and it's no diversity on the panel? Do you say something to the people who are putting the panel on to say, I think we should have more diversity. I'm not willing to do this panel if I don't see colleagues of color on the panel with me. They have something to contribute to our field as well. They're, just as much of an expert as myself. And so I think when you say speak up, it's, you can be a white person in the department speaking up against racial injustice and racism without, having to follow in the footsteps of a Black or brown person who has to speak up. You don't have to wait around. Take the initiative and pick up some of the slack off of your Black colleagues by mentioning these things. It gets tiresome. I will speak for myself. I'm not going to speak for everyone that's a member of the Black community, but it gets tiresome having to be the only one that is willing to speak up. And then you get all the applause afterwards, right? Thank you for speaking up. We appreciate you. It's like, no, you had the same amount of time to speak up yourself and you chose not to for whatever reason. I've never in my, and I'm a little bit younger than maybe you and Jen, but I've never seen a white person get fired for speaking up about diversity, inclusion, racism, social injustices. I, however, have seen some Black and brown people who have gotten fired for it. So, if you truly call yourself an advocate and an ally, it's speaking up when no one else is speaking up. It's starting the meeting. I want to address this. If you're a department head or you're the athletics director, let me start the meeting by saying we will not tolerate, or with all the things, and not sugarcoating it, but walking right down the aisle and, addressing it as these are the issues and concerns and naming them. I think that's also another thing that's important in caring for your colleagues of color during crisis is naming them. Call a spade. And that's maybe an old school term, but, being honest and upfront and not trying to hide behind politically correct words, but really calling out the issues that we are dealing with.
Yeah, great stuff, Daniel. Totally, I absolutely agree. And I can't agree more that it has to come from me, and it just can't only come from me. And I'm actually really pretty proud of my white colleagues in the department for saying, I'm doing this, I'm moving ahead with it. I mean, it's got to be everybody, or we're not going to get any better. So great point.
Jen, I want you to hop in here and answer a question that we just got. What actions do you think people need to do more of to support and to help people heal during a crisis?
So yeah, I'd go back to some of what we talked about. I do think, Daniel, you hit it. Education is a key piece. I've heard too many times people say this is about George Floyd, and quite honestly, yes, it is, but it's about so much more than that. Systematic racism has been going on, for years and years and years. And if we need to educate first so people understand how much it's built into so many of the pieces that are in place. And so I think as athletic departments, we have an obligation to do that education and to figure out the appropriate way to do it, to bring about greater knowledge on the base of everyone who's working in the department. Again, I don't want people to hear me as thinking this doesn't mean action, but I do think listening is an important piece. I think we move to action sometimes too quickly, and we haven't really taken a step back to really listen and to really attempt to understand how we can best proceed. And then I think there does have to be action, and I do think that departments have to have plans, and you have to work towards what are the steps we're taking and hold ourselves accountable to those steps specific within what that might be. And that includes the gamut. That includes what are your hiring practices and how are you ensuring that there aren't racist pieces or sexist pieces built into those hiring practices, and what policies and procedures do you have in place, and what's in your code of conduct, and what's in your student athlete handbook, and how are you ensuring that all of those things are reviewed to the point to challenge yourself, to ensure that we're building the best possible programs we can, and we're visibly saying those things. What's on our website? What are the pieces that we're doing that show where we are? And again, I think there's a piece of that plan that needs to be specific to your institution and where you are as an institution, and how you begin to help move forward. But there has to be greater levels of education, listening, and then specific actions that meet what your institution has and how you begin to move it forward.
Yeah, I think you're dead on, and I think a key piece of that is what kind of space have you provided for, and Jill or Jen, jump right on in here, to really allow your colleagues of color, your Black colleagues during this crisis, to mentally heal. What are some resources maybe, or some things? Have you provided a space for them to be able to? Jen, I know when we spoke, you talked about how the football staff, you oversee football, how they had a coaches only meeting to really talk about the unity that they need in order for their young men on their football team to show unity. So, you know, what kind of mental space has your staff or your athletic department allowed? And Jill, you can jump in here too. You know, some days off for them to really mentally heal. You know, I will shout out to my supervisor, Colleen Campbell, who I know is on the call, because she has provided me that. And I had a breakdown on Monday. And so, you know, I finally was able to get in touch with my own feelings and emotions and thoughts behind, you know, what transpired and what's going on. And she said, hey, you know, send me whatever you haven't completed that needs to be done ASAP. And, you know, take as many days as you need. And when you're ready to come back, come back. You know, is there anything that you need during this time from me? So have you guys, you know, had any of that going on in your specific department?
Yeah, I think you know, Daniel, you touched on the football example, and I think you know, there was a need for our staff to have a very open and honest conversation in order to you can only lead and you can only set an example if you're willing to be raw with each other. And I, you know, I think the other piece is, you know, you touched a lot on how do you check in and we encouraged our supervisors to make sure we provided the space that our Black colleagues needed. You know, I don't think I'm compromising anyone, but you know, one of my dear friends and someone who I value most in our department is Sherelle Jackson, and you know, she'd been struggling, and you know, we talked about it, and she took a personal day, and you know, she has two sons, and you know, I think it's really hard to think about their world and how, what that means for them, and you know, so there's the personal side of all that people are going through, and then there's the professional piece and feeling the need you know, to help really support our student athletes and staff during this time, but also the struggles you have on a personal level, and just finding the right ways to support staff individually. And then if I'm honest, I think we need to do more. We need to create spaces and small spaces for staff to be able to share and grow and be vulnerable and help each other through this time. And I'm not making an excuse when I say this, but I think, you know, COVID does create some challenges, and we have to not let those challenges hold us back. You know, it's not as personable to do things by phone or by Zoom, but if that's the limitations that we have, we can't let that hold us back from connecting and from building what we do need to do. We also, I'd say one last thing. This actually came from student athletes, not from staff, but I think staff benefited from it also. We had a group of our women's basketball and football student athletes who came forward and wanted to do something as a department, and we were able to have campus approve, not because of the injustice piece, but just because of who's allowed on campus right now, and it's closed, and you have all the COVID components. But letting us go have a moment where we could be together and take a knee for 8 minutes and 46 seconds and have some reflection time. And I think that just provided a space. Quite frankly, I think we all underestimated just seeing each other with all that we'd been through, but then also just providing a space to see solidarity.
We had a similar moment. I know Christina Fogarty on the call here with me. She and I went to our student-led solidarity walk, and it was extraordinarily powerful. And I do think I had underestimated the lack of human contact and how it's hurting all of us even more these last few weeks. And so, you know, we couldn't give out hugs as freely as I would like, but it was good to be there and take a knee with my colleagues and our students, and it was extraordinarily moving and emotional.
Absolutely. Jen, you said something, and I want to take what you said and kind of throw it over to Jill and see, you know, you talked about hiring practices and policies. So Jill, have you had a chance to look at policies that your department specifically has and the language that is in those policies as it relates to hiring practices? And if so, would you be so kind to share with us some of those policies and things that you're looking to change and the challenges that you think you're going to face during that process?
Yeah, so I'll start with hiring and say, like, policies ain't going to get it done. We just have to, we just have to open our minds. We have to network. You know, policies, great, diverse applicant pools, they're all legalistic. Everyone knows that, you know, white people sue for reverse discrimination in college athletics more than African Americans do. So we're all covering our ass with our policies, and legal has to look at them. So if we're going to make a difference, we can't rely on our policies. And so we got to take action, and it's about mentoring. It's about improving and expanding our circles. It's about the short lists that exist. It's about basketball coaches still saying there's one, you know, oh, this is my male slot, or this is my white person slot, or this is my black person. Like, this is all such bullshit. And we've let it go. We've just let it go, where we just have these spots and these short lists. And you know, the only thing wrong with having Jen and I representing college athletics here is that we're both women, right? Because it's a white male dominated industry, and a straight white male dominated industry. And if we're going to make a difference, which I hope to hell, part of my legacy can be helping to make a difference. You know, when we talk among the A10, what can we do? Like, we got to start fellowships. We've got to change our hiring practices. We've got to implement something that works along the lines of the Rooney Rule. Like, we just have to just do it. And the current policies that we have in our department, they're not enough. And like I said, they're a little bit cover your ass for my liking. So, you know, I'm just going to demand as the leader that every single pool of individuals who come on campus, every shortlist that I see is a diverse shortlist, a diverse pool. Like, that's how we're going to get it done. When I pay for professional development, I'm going to ask, who'd you meet? Who'd you meet? What Black individuals did you sit with and get to know when you're out networking? Because I'm sick of people going to network and hanging out with their white buddies and drinking Chardonnay. So that's how we're going to move the needle, is taking action, not through our policies. So I did do a pretty, when I first got to St. Joe's, like within the first year, I looked at all of our policies, and I wanted to say, you know, first of all, as a lawyer by trade, raise your hand if you know the name of the law that's the counterpart to Title IX that deals with race. Like, what in the hell is wrong with us? You don't know it, not because it's your fault, but because we haven't given a shit in college athletics, right? You have a Title IX coordinator. Where's your Title VI coordinator? Where's your policies? Where's your advocate? We just haven't done it. We haven't done it. And believe me, I am appalled by sexual misconduct, and we need to do more. But it's like all of these resources on Title IX, and we just really haven't done anything. Like, no one knows Title VI exists and prohibits race discrimination in higher education. So we have so much work to do as an industry. You know, and frankly, the Title VI law doesn't have the same regs that Title IX does. So, you know, the failure starts with the government, as it does in many cases lately. But anyway, other policies that I looked at our drug testing policy. I looked at disparate impact of various policies on various groups in our department. One of them that I realized was our housing policy. You know, we had basically two teams that were required to live on campus all 4 years, and those are the two teams that have the most Black student athletes. So why are we doing that? Are we sending a message intentionally or unintentionally that we don't trust our Black student athletes, but the white kids can go live where they want to? Like, those are the kind of things we got to start looking at critically if we're going to make a difference. And so, you know, I went up and down every policy we had. And, you know, we were coming up with a transgender policy now in our department. Guess why? Because we have a transgender student coming. But why in the hell are they going to come if we don't have a policy and let them know that they're welcome, right? So we can't just wait to do these kind of things. We got to be proactive. And anyway, sorry, I got a little passionate, but it's certainly not going to stop with policies, but I do suggest going through your departmental policies if you're in a position to do so, and say, how are they impacting? You know, transfers. Do your transfer policies into your institution have a racially disparate impact? You know, we just finally last week implemented block scheduling from community colleges. Like, that's huge. But prior to that, we made it pretty darn unfriendly to come to St. Joe's. You know, from certain places that were less white than others. So anyway, it's not the be all end all, but policies are an important piece of who we pretend we are, and are we living up to those, and how can we make them more inclusive?
Yeah, Dan, just to piggyback on that, I 100% agree with Jill that policy and procedures aren't the end all and be all, but I think the other piece is there's just systematic pieces of racism that are built into some of them that if we don't start tearing down, it, it's going to continue to hold us back. And so I think taking an honest look at those policies is really important. And I think Jill gave some prime examples that you don't necessarily think about on an everyday piece, but you have to look across the board as to how you can move the needle on whether it's housing or other pieces that touch student life and then ultimately staff life. And the last thing I just say on hiring, it's human nature to hire people who are like you. And if we don't start having honest conversation, and that happens too often in athletics, we just, we don't go through a hiring process. We just hire the person who we know, who we're comfortable with, who looks like us and acts like us and has a background like us. And that doesn't necessarily, come out in a direct process that you set up, but I think we have to challenge ourselves to really expand our networks, as Jill talked about, to broaden those pools, but more so than broaden the pools, to expand our own networks, to build beyond that, so we can be in positions to hire differently, because we all know that we're more effective if we have differing views sitting around the table, and if we have differing backgrounds, and we can build from that. But I think it's really important to recognize that, again, that human nature part, to hire the person who's like you and more comfortable, but really get outside of that and understand. Yes, I think we understand conceptually you want to hire someone, you hire to your weaknesses, we talk that talk, but then we don't challenge ourselves to put ourselves in a position to expand our networks and do more to bring about who's being brought into those pools. Because if we're honest, so much in athletics isn't about who applied and who sent an application and who, it's just not the way it works. And that does restrict our ability to hire differently. And so I think we have to do a lot of different things to make those challenges, but expanding the networks and then challenging how we hire is important.
Yeah, I think.
Daniel,
Go ahead.
Oh, go ahead. Oh, okay. So one thing that I think has a ton of opportunity, but also the potential to land in a discriminatory fashion, is the name, image, and likeness. So I could talk for hours about this, but I served on the federal and state legislative working group, and now I'm on the legislative solutions group. This is opportunity. I mean, many people have kind of cited this as a civil rights issue, in that we've been holding back our student athletes, many of whom are women and students of color. Now I worry that they're not going to get the same training and education at some institutions. And I really do think this is a great opportunity for female athletes, for our Black student athletes to generate additional income with their branding. But it's really complex. It's complex stuff. And you've got departments with 20-person compliance departments and branding specialists on campus. And so I just want to throw out there that I will come personally or by video to any HBCU or other low resourced institution, and I will spend time with your student athletes educating them, because this is something we need to level the playing field and have everybody up and ready to roll. So hit me up offline if you want to take advantage of me talking to your team, if you're a coach, or your student athletes as a whole, and share everything I know about how to get yourself ready to roll for this.
Yeah, I think you guys hit on a couple of things that I want to touch on. I think one of the things, Jill, as we were talking about policies, and Jen, as we were talking about policies, is so many exceptions to this policy. We created this policy as an exception to cancel this policy. So I think that's another thing that we have to analyze is, yes, when we're looking at policies, is there a policy that's going to cancel out this policy that makes, hiring this white person acceptable when we clearly, have this policy in place? So that's one thing. The second thing is, I saw this today on Twitter. For those of you who know, I think Nikki Weber-Moore is one of the athletic directors who I am familiar with, who is doing a lot as it relates to diversity, equity, and inclusion in our arena. She came out with a statement, and this was through Athletic Director University. It says, "When we are allowed to bring our full selves to the job, we bring something that adds a different dimension. That's the value of diversity in the workplace." So I think, that speaks volumes to kind of what you, Jen, and what you, Jill, were just mentioning is, when we have this diversity, how powerful is our department? How much better are we when we have, individuals who have different mindsets coming to the table. Is your senior staff all composed of, white males or white women? Do you have any diversity on your senior staff? Who's speaking up for the Black people in the department? If you have a senior staff and it's composed of 8 people and your department is all white in your senior staff, who's talking about the diversity? Who's talking about the needs of your Black student athletes? And that's not to say that white athletic directors and white senior staff won't, but it's at the forefront of the mind of those Black and brown colleagues that you do have in your department. And who's to say, yeah, you have senior staff meetings. Who's to say that you can't bring in someone else who may not be on the senior staff to those meetings to challenge you and to make you think about certain things? I think about that, as well as, statements were released, were people reaching out to their Black colleagues in their departments to ask, is this statement, really getting out what you're trying to convey? Is this insensitive or is this tone deaf? I saw a lot of statements that may have been tone deaf or centered around themselves. And so, that's another thing that I think, during this process of caring for our colleagues of color during a crisis is, are you having conversations and asking the people who it's directly affecting to be a part of the conversation and what they need during the process? So moving kind of along, we have, and once again, people feel free to write any questions in the chat. If you don't feel comfortable writing it, you can write a private question for us to discuss and talk about. So feel free to go ahead and take advantage of that. So Jen, I want to ask you, how can you address the current issues with your white staff while having them analyze their own biases and, really analyzing their own thoughts during this process when we talk about social injustice and racism?
Yeah, I mean, I think there has to be, I'll go back to, I think what you hit at the beginning, Daniel, and I know we've said it, but there has to be some level of education um, and listening for our white colleagues, and then it can't rely on our Black staff to do that education. I think we have to as departments share resources and encourage and to some extent require that we do a better job of educating and helping folks understand, because I think there is we have to encourage the self-awareness. We have to be able to be transparent and honest with what our white privilege is and what our inherent biases are, and how we're aware of them in decision making and in interfaces and in how we come to work every day. And I think that's easier for some than for others, and I think some are not fully aware of what their biases are. And we've had conversations internally struggling with what you require and what you offer, because when you offer something, even if you offer a session on white privilege as an example, and who's gonna show up? Probably people who have already done the self-reflection and already thought about it, and again could use the education and assistance for sure. But are you missing a group of people who need it equally as much? And how do you begin to balance that piece of it as well, and bring about exposure for all, and work towards that education across the board? I think the last piece is just the dialogue, and creating the spaces to have the dialogue and build those that opportunity for white staff to listen and begin to try and hear what our Black colleagues are experiencing, and help them help our white colleagues understand that. I've heard, you probably have too, and I've heard from my Black colleagues that to some extent they're tired of white people asking what they can do. But I think as a white person, I have to help white people with what they can do. And yes, some of that does fall to them, but I think we have to help them with that piece of it if we're gonna be able to move it forward. And again, I think it's me being vulnerable. It's me being honest about what my biases are, and what the privilege that I've had, and understanding that, and recognizing that there are pieces of what I need to do better. And I think sometimes we try too hard to hide that, and that doesn't that doesn't help move us forward, and that's not genuine, and that's not real, and that's not how we bring about progress. We have to be open about that and talk about that, and then begin to move us all forward.
So, with that being said, I want to go into this thought, Jen, you said, what what are some things that you have done specifically to educate yourself so that you can be better off in these conversations, so that you can challenge some of your white colleagues? Maybe whether it's resources, whether it's some experiences recently, what are some things that you have done specifically? And what are some things that you are maybe even thinking of doing that you believe will be beneficial?
Yeah. So I mean, I'll go back to, I've tried to have conversations with people who I trust and who I know will be honest with me, who can, um, help me better understand, where I am and how we can begin to move it forward. And then I think there's certainly, it is reading, it is, doing research, it is understanding what systematic racism is, and how it dates back, generations, and how we, it's understanding all those pieces in order to help put this in perspective as a white person. Again, going back to what I said, this is certainly about George Floyd, but it's not only about George Floyd. And I've heard too many times in the last 2 weeks that that's what this is about. And again, I am not minimizing. What happened to George Floyd is absolutely horrific and is part of why we're having this conversation, but it is so much deeper than that. And I think, we have to help ensure that our white colleagues understand that and can help relate to that. It's I think it's also challenging when you hear things, and helping move the needle in that regard, and that self. I think I've done a lot of self reflection, too, Daniel, to help myself better understand how I see the world, and how I can begin to make changes in my daily interface.
Yeah, I think the saying that comes to mind for me after listening to you, Jen, is get comfortable being uncomfortable for our white
Yeah.
colleagues. I see in the chat. Thank you, AJ, for that comment. Um, Someone said today, if you're afraid of the pain of being called out for contributing to racism, imagine the pain of experiencing racism every day. So I think that kind of ties right into this conversation. Um, so Jill, I'll ask you, what advice would you give staff members who want to be in the conversation but are afraid to say the wrong thing?
Like, I think we just, I know this sounds easier said than done, but we just have to, you got to jump out there. You got to put yourself out there. And it's easy for me to say when I sat and cried for 2 days before I could even draft my own statement. So I get it. But when you say what things have I done, like I've really, really, really tried to put myself out there. And Fogi, you're gonna laugh if you're still on the call because I already told you this, but like I had a conversation with my Uber driver and I ended up crying for like I just wanted his perspective. I wanted to know how he was feeling and what he was, and we had this most moving educational conversation that like literally had me in tears at the end of my Uber ride. And yes, there might be a misstep. And what happens if you misstep and say the wrong thing? That's okay. You apologize, you thank, and you move on. Because again, I think our unwillingness to step in it is really holding us back. Um, I'm dedicating myself only to movies that give me more insight into the Black experience. I just picked up The Nickel Boys, which is a fantastic book. I am just trying to immerse myself in police defunding, which I think is really misunderstood. So one of my college friends is a lawyer for the FOP, which I can't even begin to understand how that job works. But I called her and I said, "Can you tell me? I want to."
Uh-oh, Jill, did we lose you?
Did I go?
Yep.
Yeah.
Oh, you're back.
Anyway, those are some of the. Did you get the defunding? Those are the kind of things I've been trying to do, is educate myself on the hot issues. Like, it's one thing for me to say go vote. It's another thing if your state or your area is a total shit show in trying to keep Black people from voting. Like, what are we going to do about that? So I think we need to see in our areas where we can turn our talk into action. I can't remember what your question was, but that came to mind.
It's all right. I think, that is the biggest thing, is just seeing action steps from our white colleagues. As a member of the Black community, it's one thing for us to have this conversation, and that's all great, but to see you in action, you don't need to tell me all your action steps. You don't have to tell me that you're going out to protest or that you read this book. And granted, I'd love to have a conversation with you if you have read it, to dissect it and to help you educate. But it starts, with self, and what are things that you can do on your own without having to tell someone to get a round of applause, but really going out and being intentional, really going to see, when you see things out in the world, are you speaking up, or are you, just being on the sidelines, since we're talking about sports? Are you on the sideline just watching the game, or are you getting in the game? Are you getting dirty? Are you, understanding that you also may lose something? And I think that's a big part that has to be understood, is Black people, brown people are losing their lives. As a white colleague, if you call yourself an ally and an advocate, what are you willing to lose? Because you probably will end up losing something. But I can guarantee you the joy that you'll feel knowing that you did what's right is going to be more than the pain you feel from whatever you lost. And so as we move on, I just want us to keep that in mind. And let's see, I think we may have some questions in the chat. As administrators, how can we, and Jill or Jen, feel free to go ahead and jump in here. But the question is, let me see, as administrators, how can we begin preparing Black student athletes for what they're going to experience in the workplace without making our white student athletes feel like they are being left out? And I'll jump in if you guys, want to process or think. If not, just go ahead and jump right in.
I think I would love to hear your thoughts, Daniel. And I'll only say one of the things we've been talking about is how this doesn't become a 2-week issue or a 1-month issue, is how we integrate the issues of justice and equality into our leadership academy, into our career services. I mean, to me, there are issues for everyone involved with diversity and racism that are relevant in the career world. And so, as we plan to educate and do create some special modules for our student athletes on career issues, like we simply have to address race and other issues of equality. I think systemically throughout it, this can't just be come for this workshop on racism. It's gotta find its way. And I think whoever raised career is really right on point. And there's issues for everybody.
Well, and I think I'd add to that, Daniel. One, it's not about separating; it's about educating, and we owe it to we have to help prepare our Black student athletes, and the world is different for them, so we have to do that. But I also think we have an obligation to educate our white students so they see the world differently than our generation did, and that's an important piece of it too. And so, as educators, which we are first, we have to focus on that piece of it and come up with the piece for our student athletes that finds the balance between the two and allows our Black student athletes to be heard and provides them the safe space to continue dialogue and helps prepare them. We had a town hall with our students, and one of the things that struck me was, how do I be brave in a space outside of my sport? Well, shoot, we gotta help them be brave in those spaces outside their sport. And that's an obligation as an administrator to help them through that. But I think I don't want to miss our obligation to educate our white student athletes too, and to help them have their voice to make a change. I wish I could remember who said this to me in the last 2 weeks, because I owe them a quote. But somebody said to me, if Blacks could have solved institutional racism, the problem would have been solved. it has to be whites walking with blacks if we're going to make major changes in our society that have to happen. And so we have to do that across the board for all of our student athletes and ourselves. But it's this next generation that hopefully is going to do better than we did.
Absolutely. I would honestly say that some of the experiences that they may have in the workplace are going to be identical to what they live every day in life. And that's
Mhm.
quite sad, but I think that's the honest truth. Some of the things that they're going to deal with is, things that they've already had to do or deal with, and it's just navigating it in a different space. I think it's more of teaching them strategically how to accomplish things that they want to accomplish, get to where they want to go, challenge things that they are challenging, and it doesn't have to come from a black person. You know, my supervisor tells me all the time, maybe that's not the fight that you really want to fight. Maybe it's something bigger that you want to fight. So I have to think about that all the time, and it's one of those things that you have to be quite frank and honest and upfront with them. They are going to deal with some things in the workplace, and I think as you said, Jen, it's telling um, our white student athletes, like, you have some benefits of being white, you have some privileges. You're not going to deal with some of the same things as your black counterparts or your black teammates. And so it's a matter of, I remember someone telling me, a white student athlete, that they were underqualified for the job. They found out that it was a black candidate who was qualified for the job and should have gotten the job opportunity, and they got it simply off of the fact that they were white, and that they turned down the position because they said that's not the kind of company or organization that they wanted to work for. And so it's things like that, of standing up and saying, you know what, I know for a fact that there was a candidate, a black student or a black professional who really deserved this position, maybe more than I did. And I know that's probably hard to do. It's like, I need this job, or this is a great opportunity for me. However, that's one of the ways in which we can begin to speak up against some of the things that they're going to have to deal with. But I think, quite frankly, it won't be much of a difference than some of their life experiences, and that's sad to say, but I think that's the reality of what our black students have to deal with. So as we move on in the conversation, Jill, what are some things that you would say, because I know in conversation that you touched on this on Friday on the panel that you were on. What suggestions do you have for Black and Brown colleagues in the industry on how to navigate in a space where they may be the only or one of very few people of color in their department? What are some suggestions, some things to think about strategically? And I think this kind of ties right into the question we were just referring to. How do you navigate? What are some suggestions you have when they want to speak up on a topic maybe such as this, and are afraid to because they'll be ostracized even more maybe than they already are?
Yeah, that's such a good question and a tough one. And there's a version of it in the chat that may have come into me privately. But either let's expand that a little to say either I'm a lone person of color, a lone Black person in my department, or at some place in my department or at my university, we've hit a wall. We've hit someone who really, frankly, doesn't care. And so that could be my head coach, that could be my athletic director, that could be my university president. And so whether it's you really are alone, or you're unsupported, not supported. First and foremost, and this is easy for me to say because there may come a time in one's life where you're not at the right institution. And so I want to admit and acknowledge that these might not all be solvable problems. But I would find allies. I would find campus partners who are allies. They don't necessarily have to come in the athletic department. And I would find people in the industry who are allies. I'm happy to be anyone's ally. I've already talked to a couple coaches wanting to understand at public institution what their First Amendment rights are. As I mentioned, I'm a retired lawyer and my dad's a retired First Amendment professor. You do have rights. Unfortunately, if you work at private institutions, you don't, because the First Amendment does not apply, but you've got freedom of speech rights. They are limited. And so, you know, I'm happy, reach out to me directly. I'm happy to have that conversation with you, but sometimes you need that sounding board to say, where are my lines here? And so find your allies in the department, in the university, or in the industry is one thing. And then at some point, you know, you might just have to jump and say it. And it's going to be very, very scary. I've dealt with that on the LGBTQ front with my own personal life and experiences, being very scared to tell people who I am. And at some point, you just kind of got to say, they don't like me for it, I'm moving on.
Yeah, I think, you know, as we spoke, you know, last week,
It's a rabbit.
big thing on that is also being strategic and maybe, you know, ego stroking in order to get to where you need to go, right?
Yeah, that's right. I forgot that piece. We had a great conversation with some head coaches on a call last week. One thing that ADs love is self-preservation. And so we were talking about a head coach was saying my AD has not issued a statement, and, you know, the head coach went to him and said, I can help you. I can help you. You know, prospects are watching, your boss is watching. I can help you, boss. How can I help you? And again, it shouldn't have to be your responsibility, but the sort of ass kissing approach has worked for a few of my colleagues whose athletic directors have then said, okay, like, thank you. I'd love to take you up on that. So yeah, sometimes you do have to be maybe a little strategic.
Jen, I see you over there scratching. You must be outside. The mosquitoes must be getting to you.
They are. I'm sorry.
Oh, you're fine. I guess, you know, what are some diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives, programming, or seminars that, you know, maybe you and your staff have been looking into that may help move the needle forward in your department?
Yeah, I think, you know, again, I think it comes back to what are the specific needs and how do you begin to assess who are appropriate, what are appropriate topics and what are appropriate, you know, speakers. But I go back to, I think it's starting with even a basic understanding of you know, what racism is and how that has impacted, you know, Black individuals for so long. I think it's also an understanding of white privilege and educating people on white privilege, and looking for the appropriate pieces to bring that in. I'd also say I think it really is a partnership with campus. Like, athletics doesn't operate in isolation, and so I think it really is working with the multicultural, you know, folks on campus to work through programming and to have individuals who can come in and begin to have those dialogues and those conversations to best help move us forward and do that in, you know, we have a culture committee, and challenging that group to really help us as a department begin to identify what the appropriate pieces are for us, and then how do we break ourselves into, you know, when you have 220 some people in your department, it's hard to have an open dialogue with 220 some people. So how do you get into smaller groups to begin to have effective conversations, and how do you make it a part of what we do, you know, on a daily basis, but on the standpoint of what we do regularly throughout the year, not just let's bring in a speaker here and forget about it and not continue to move forward. So I think it's setting that stage to be something more, you know, long lasting, not just short term with, okay, this is the hot topic now and we're going to bring in a speaker to talk about it.
And Daniel, I would add to that, you know, what resonates with the audience, right? So I think Katie Kuster, you're on the call. I think you guys had the opportunity of having Natasha Cloud, one of your relatively recent alums, who's been maybe one of the most powerful voices in the WNBA, come join your team. That's going to resonate in a way with that team that me getting an EverFi course on racism, or, you know, some of that frankly, crap that's out there. So we have a men's rower who's created a channel setting the tone. He's putting some great stuff out there. Like, that's going to be more likely to resonate with my student athletes than anything I could maybe get off the shelf. So I think it's finding, like Jen said, what resonates with whoever you're trying to educate at the moment and being creative.
As we begin to wrap up here, if you have questions, kind of the last opportunities for you to ask any questions, feel free to. Like I said, if you're not comfortable putting it into the chat for everyone, there is a button where you specifically send it to me. But if not, this will be the last kind of conversational piece. And this is for you both. In what ways do you, as a white supervisor, show vulnerability during this time?
So I spent, probably too much information, but I spent the first 35 years of my life boxing up all my emotions. And so I've really worked on that. And so now I've become like a crier. Daniel, I think you were working with me at Notre Dame for about a week when I had a little office retreat, and you were like, "What? She's sobbing." And so just showing my emotion and being me and being as authentic as I can. And showing, not being afraid to cry or show emotion, and not being afraid to tell what you don't know, not being afraid to say when you stepped in it and made a mistake. I think those are all really critical parts of being a leader, and I've tried to get better at that. And again, I'm not perfect, but I certainly step in it a lot, and I'm happy to share when I do.
Yeah, I mean, I certainly agree. I think sharing emotion is important piece of vulnerability. I think the other pieces, and I've noticed in a couple of questions, and it's come up a little bit, but we spend too much time being afraid to say the wrong thing, and then that holds us back on doing anything. And I think we can't continue to be afraid of that. I think we have to have those conversations, and I think I've been able to do that with some colleagues over the last couple of weeks, and I think that's shown my vulnerability. I think it's also being honest with the self-reflection, of my own self, and where I can do more, and beginning to have those conversations honestly with people. We all want people to think we're perfect and that we don't have improvement, and that's just not true. And I think showing that vulnerability of where we have messed, as Jill eloquently said, where we stepped in it, but I think where we have made mistakes or we haven't done enough, and how we're going to get better from that, and being able to be vulnerable in those moments, and say that out loud and have those conversations, and understand how that in and of itself can help move the needle, and change what might happen next time.
And Daniel, it's incredibly extra scary to be vulnerable when you're in this industry and trying to get ahead in the industry, and you're Black or a woman or gay or fill in the blank or all of the above, because it is so damn hard, to get and keep jobs. And so I get that. I get that it's really, really, really hard to make yourself truly vulnerable when people could say, "Oh, Jill wants to be a DAD here in 10 years, but she's a crier, or she's too, fill in the blank." Like, it makes it extra hard, particularly if you're not in the straight white male group, to make yourself truly vulnerable, because everybody's watching.
Yeah, and I guess I just add to my last piece of vulnerability. I do think it's putting myself out there with leadership to make changes. To Jill's point, that is vulnerable and sometimes scary, but I think it's something we have to continue to do, across the board, if we want to move together collectively.
Absolutely. I'm extremely grateful for you, Jen and Jill, for joining me in what I would say is one of the tougher conversations, for being transparent and vulnerable. I do appreciate everyone for joining us in this conversation as we close. I am recording this, so if you want to send to colleagues, an email will be going out to you that you can forward, that will have this a link to this attached. But once again, I want to tell you guys thank you from the bottom of my heart. I appreciate you coming on and having a really hard discussion, but also for educating us and telling us your story, but in the ways in which you care for your colleagues of color. So I do want to say thank you. Also, for anyone, I think Jill already did it, but Jen, if you want to put your email in the chat for people to connect with you offline, I will also put my email in the chat, even though it may be attached to your registration. Feel free to reach out. I love connecting. We also don't have anything else to do during this time. So get my email in here as well. I would love to have, conversations outside of this realm if you want to.
Well,
But
well, to make y'all laugh, I misspelled Miami in my email, so I'll type it right again the second time.
To make you all really laugh, Jen and I are actually on the same back porch. She got the lit version. I'm on the unlit version of the porch. So I'm getting a little time away in Miami. So Daniel, I just want to say I'm really proud of you. I'm proud of you for everything you've been doing these last few years, but none more so in these last couple of weeks. I know it's been emotionally draining for you. You were vulnerable and mentioned you had your breakdown, but I stand with you now and always, and I'm really proud of what you're doing.
Thank you. Well, with that being
Thanks, everybody.
mic drop, I am closing this meeting. I appreciate you all for coming and look forward to connecting with you in the future.